She inherited her grandparents' farm and planned to sell it in a year. Her neighbors laughed at her for starting to build, according to old records. But when winter came, it became clear why it was necessary. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city or country you are watching from. She had not expected the letter to arrive at a moment of weakness, but perhaps there was never a moment when it would not have found one. The envelope lay among contracts, invitations, and review copies of books she no longer remembered writing. Her name was printed in a clean, impersonal font, the kind used by law offices that dealt not with lives, but with outcomes. She opened it standing by the kitchen counter of her apartment, coffee cooling beside her, city noise rising steadily through the open window like a tide she had learned to ignore. The farm had belonged to her grandparents. That was how the letter put it, as if ownership were a simple fact rather than a layered history. A parcel of land, a house, several outbuildings, transferred to her as the sole remaining heir. No expressions of sympathy, no acknowledgement of memory, just coordinates, acreage, and a request for acknowledgement. She sat down only after she finished reading, not because the news shocked her, but because it unsettled her in a quieter way. Her grandparents had existed in her life like old photographs kept in a drawer, real but distant, softened by time and infrequent visits. She remembered summer afternoons, the smell of soil and cut grass, her grandmother's hands always busy with something practical. She remembered her grandfather less clearly, a presence more than a figure, solid and unremarkable in the way mountains are until one tries to move them. For years, she had built her life far from that place. She lived in one of the largest states in the country, in a city that rewarded speed and punished pause. She was a writer by profession, a successful one by most measures. Her books sold well, were discussed, occasionally praised for their precision and restraint. She was invited to speak, to comment, to analyze. Words had become her material and her shield. They allowed her to observe without participating, to describe without committing. Yet lately, the words had begun to circle. Each new manuscript felt like a careful rearrangement of sentences she had already written. Editors praised her consistency. Readers called her reliable. She felt something thinner beneath that praise, a narrowing she could not articulate without sounding ungrateful. The farm arrived in her life as a logistical problem, not an emotional one. She told herself this immediately and repeated it often. It was an asset, possibly a burden, certainly temporary. She would go there in the spring, assess the condition of the property, make minimal repairs if necessary, and sell it in the fall. The money would fund her next project, perhaps buy time, perhaps buy space. It was a practical plan, clean and reasonable. She did not tell anyone about the letter for several days. She answered emails, attended meetings, signed contracts. Only at night did she find herself thinking about the land, about the way silence had sounded there, dense and alive. She told herself it was nostalgia, the kind that grew when one spent too long indoors. She told herself it meant nothing. When spring came, it arrived abruptly, as it often did in the city. One week, the streets were gray and brittle. The next, they were loud with color and motion. She packed her car with a care that surprised her, bringing notebooks, reference books, a laptop she told herself she might not need. She drove west for hours, the landscape slowly flattening, the air changing in a way she could feel even through closed windows. The farm lay outside a small rural community, not isolated, but removed enough to feel self-contained. The house stood where she remembered it, weathered, but upright, its shape familiar in the way of something seen long ago in a dream. The fields around it were bare, the soil dark and heavy from recent thaw. There was a stillness there that pressed against her senses, not empty, but watchful. Inside the house, time had moved unevenly. Some rooms felt abandoned, others merely paused. Furniture stood where it had been left, surfaces dulled by dust rather than neglect. There were no decorations chosen for beauty alone. Everything had served a purpose. The kitchen bore marks of repeated use, the floors worn smooth in narrow paths that revealed habits rather than design. She explored the property slowly, as if expecting it to resist her presence. There were sheds, fences leaning but intact, a cellar door set into the earth near the back of the house. The cellar itself was cool and dark, the air heavy with a smell she could not name but recognized as fundamental. It was not unpleasant, only unfamiliar. It was in the attic that she found the notebooks. They were stacked in a wooden crate, wrapped in cloth, protected with a care that suggested they mattered. She carried them downstairs one by one, her arms aching by the time she finished. She sat at the old kitchen table and opened the first notebook, with a hesitation she did not understand. Her grandmother's handwriting was neat, compact, without ornament. Dates appeared at the top of each page, followed by entries that read like inventories rather than reflections. Weather conditions, soil moisture, planting decisions, quantities preserved, adjustments made. There were no descriptions of feelings, no commentary on hardship or joy. It was a record meant to be used, not remembered. At first, she smiled at the austerity of it. This was not the kind of material writers romanticized. There were no stories, no metaphors, just work, repeated and refined. Yet as she read, she felt a subtle shift in herself. These were not notes for posterity. They were instructions written under the assumption that someone would need them. She told herself she would read a few pages and put them away. Instead, she read until the light changed and the kitchen grew dim. She did not yet understand what she was reading, but she recognized its coherence. Each entry depended on the last. Each decision accounted for consequences not immediately visible. That night, she slept poorly. The house made sounds she did not remember, settling noises that reminded her she was a guest in a structure built for endurance rather than comfort. In the early morning, she rose and made coffee, sitting again at the table with the notebooks. She told herself she was only curious. By mid-morning, she had made a decision she had not planned to make. She would stay the year. Not because the farm demanded it, and not because she felt obligated to her grandparents' memory. She framed it as research, as immersion. 1 year living according to the rhythms recorded in those notebooks. 1 year to observe what happened when she followed instructions written for survival rather than productivity. She justified the decision with professional language. A single year was not a commitment. It was a study. She would write while she was there, perhaps something different, perhaps nothing at all. The farm would remain for sale in her mind, an endpoint she could reach whenever she chose. As she stepped outside that morning, the air cool against her skin, she noticed the fields more carefully. The soil was ready. The land had been waiting, not for her, but for use. She stood there longer than necessary, the notebooks held against her chest, and for the first time since arriving, she felt something other than detachment. It was not belonging. It was not nostalgia. It was the unsettling awareness that she had stepped into a system larger than her intentions, one that did not ask what she planned to do, only what she would actually do next. That awareness followed her as she began to prepare the land, marking dates in the margins of her own notebook, copying her grandmother's entries with the precision of someone who did not yet trust herself to improvise. The year had begun, whether she was ready or not, and the farm, patient and unassuming, waited to see if she would learn how to listen. The decision to remain for a year did not immediately make her feel rooted. If anything, it sharpened her sense of displacement. Each morning she woke with the familiar impulse to check her phone, to measure the day by messages and obligations, only to remember that there was no one waiting for her response here. The farm did not care whether she was productive or inspired. It responded only to action. She began the spring work cautiously, almost apologetically, as if afraid the land would expose her incompetence. The notebooks lay open on the kitchen table, weighted down by a mug and a stone she had picked up near the cellar door. She copied dates into her own notebook, aligning them carefully with the current year, aware that she did not fully understand what she was doing. The entries offered no explanations, only instructions. Plant on this day. Turn the soil to this depth. Wait if the ground holds too much water. Proceed if it does not. Her first attempts were clumsy. The soil resisted her shovel, heavy and cold, sticking to the metal in a way that made each movement deliberate. Her hands blistered quickly. She had not used them for this kind of work in years, if ever. There was no graceful transition from writer to farmer, no montage of discovery. There was only effort and discomfort, and the quiet frustration of realizing how much she had taken her body for granted. Yet something unexpected happened as the days passed. The work imposed a rhythm she could not escape. She could not hurry the ground, could not negotiate with it the way she negotiated with words. If she tried to do too much in one day, the next punished her with exhaustion. If she ignored the weather, the soil reminded her of its presence in uncooperative ways. Slowly, reluctantly, she adjusted. She followed the notebook with a precision that surprised her. She planted when the dates indicated, even when neighbors passed by and commented that she was early or late, according to modern standards. She resisted the urge to look up alternative methods online, telling herself that the experiment only worked if she committed fully. The notebook did not account for convenience. It accounted for outcomes. The first seedlings appeared on a cool morning when she had nearly convinced herself she had failed. She stood over the rows, uncertain at first whether she was imagining them, then felt a small, sharp satisfaction when she recognized the unmistakable shape of new growth. It was not joy exactly, but a sense of correctness, as if something had aligned properly for the first time in weeks. She noticed differences as the garden developed. The plants grew evenly, their color consistent, their stems sturdy. When she visited a neighboring plot at the edge of the community, she saw uneven growth, leaves already showing signs of stress. The contrast unsettled her. She had assumed that traditional methods were quaint, perhaps effective under certain conditions, but she had not expected them to outperform what she assumed were more advanced approaches. Her neighbors watched her with polite curiosity. They greeted her when they passed, asked general questions, offered advice she did not always take. There was a sense among them that she was indulging in something temporary, a personal project that would end when she returned to her real life. She did not correct them. At that stage, she believed it herself. In the evenings, she returned to the notebooks. She read not only the current season's entries, but those from years past, tracing patterns she had not noticed before. She began to see how decisions made in spring affected what followed months later. The notebooks were cumulative. They assumed memory. They assumed continuity. She found herself thinking differently about time. In the city, time had been segmented, measured in deadlines and releases, in quarters and fiscal years. Here, time folded back on itself. This spring was not just this spring. It was one iteration in a long sequence, shaped by choices made decades earlier. Her grandmother's presence grew clearer through the writing, not as a personality, but as a mind at work. The woman who had written these entries had not been sentimental. She had been attentive. She had observed what happened and adjusted accordingly, not out of curiosity but necessity. There was no room in the notebooks for vanity. As the season advanced, the physical labor became less foreign. Her hands toughened. Her movements grew more efficient. she learned to recognize the difference between fatigue and injury, between discomfort and danger. The land began to respond to her with a predictability that felt earned rather than granted. It was during one of these evenings, when the light lingered longer than she expected, and the air carried the first hint of warmth, that she encountered the entries about the winter. They were not marked as significant. They appeared among others, the same handwriting, the same restraint. But the content shifted. Mentions of shortages, adjustments to rations, notes about storage conditions, about maintaining balance rather than abundance. She read those pages more slowly. The winter described there was not a singular disaster, but a sustained test. Supplies dwindled. Temperatures fell. The usual systems failed. What struck her most was not the severity of the conditions, but the tone of the writing. There was no panic. There was calculation. She closed the notebook and sat in silence, the sounds of the evening settling around her. For the first time, the idea of winter here did not feel abstract. The forecasts she had heard in passing, the vague talk of a harsh season, began to take on weight. She understood then that her grandmother had not written for comfort or posterity. She had written to ensure continuity, to pass on what could not be improvised under pressure. The thought unsettled her more than she cared to admit. She had come here assuming she could leave whenever she chose. She had treated the year as a contained experience, bounded and safe. Now she saw that the cycle she had entered did not recognize such boundaries. If she followed it through, she would have to accept its consequences as well as its satisfactions. As spring deepened, she found herself less inclined to question the notebook. Trust replaced skepticism, not because she understood everything it contained, but because it worked. The land responded. The plants grew. The system held. She stood one evening at the edge of the field, looking back toward the house, the cellar door visible near the slope of the earth. She had not yet examined it closely. It had existed in her mind as part of the inheritance, a structure like any other. Now, with the winter entries fresh in her thoughts, it seemed to demand attention. She did not yet know why, but she sensed that the coming months would require more than curiosity and effort. They would require preparation, the kind that could not be rushed once the season turned. The notebooks had begun to teach her that survival was not a matter of resilience alone, but of foresight. Spring was teaching her how to listen. Autumn, she suspected, would teach her whether she had listened well enough. Autumn did not announce itself all at once. It crept into the days gradually, first as a subtle change in the angle of light, then as a chill that lingered in the mornings a little longer than before. The fields that had been dark and expectant in spring now carried the weight of growth, leaves thick and heavy, stalks bending under what they had produced. She moved through them with a familiarity that would have startled her months earlier, noting what was ready, what needed time, what required immediate attention. By then, the notebooks were no longer curiosities. They had become companions. She no longer read them only in the evenings, but carried them with her, pages marked, margins filled with her own careful notes. Her handwriting, once loose and expressive, had grown tighter, more precise, unconsciously mirroring her grandmother's style. She noticed the change one evening and closed the notebook with a faint sense of unease, as if she were slowly disappearing into someone else's rhythm. The first mention of the coming winter appeared not in the notebooks, but on the radio. A local forecast, delivered with casual seriousness, spoke of long-range models and unusual patterns forming farther north. A colder season than average, the voice said, possibly severe. She listened without moving, the sound of the announcer blending with the quiet hum of the house. At first, she dismissed it as seasonal exaggeration. Every year, someone predicted an extreme winter. Most passed without incident, but the forecasts did not stop. Over the following weeks, they grew more specific, more confident. Extended cold, heavy snowfall, increased strain on infrastructure. The language shifted subtly from possibility to expectation. Neighbors mentioned it in passing, half joking, half concerned. There was talk of stocking up early, of checking generators, of hoping for the best. She responded by returning to the notebooks with renewed attention. She read the autumn entries from the years surrounding the winter her grandmother had described only briefly before. This time, she did not skim. She traced each line carefully, aware now that what she held was not history, but instruction. The tone of the writing changed as the season advanced. There was no drama in it, no emphasis, yet the shift was unmistakable. Quantities were listed with greater care. Notes about storage appeared more frequently. Mentions of trade, of sharing, of coordination among families entered the margins. Hunger was not named directly, but its presence pressed against the words. She began to understand that the winter her grandmother recorded had not been a single catastrophic event. It had been a slow constriction. Supplies dwindled, not because there had been nothing to begin with, but because what existed had not been enough for the duration. The difference mattered. It meant that survival had depended not on sudden heroism, but on sustained management. The system described in the notebooks unfolded across multiple seasons. It was not simply about preserving food, but about anticipating failure points. Meat was salted, not only according to weight, but according to expected humidity. Root vegetables were stored at depths calculated to remain stable regardless of surface conditions. Nothing was done for tradition's sake alone. Every practice had been tested, refined, adjusted. And then there were the notes on community. Her grandmother wrote about others not as dependents, but as variables that had to be accounted for. Families larger than expected, illness, injury. The system expanded to absorb those shocks, not because generosity demanded it, but because isolation would have ensured collapse. It was in one of these entries that she encountered the first clear reference to the cellar roof. The mention was brief, almost casual, a line noting that the additional structure had been completed before the ground froze, another noting the difference it made when temperatures fluctuated sharply. There was no explanation offered, no justification. The roof was treated as obvious. She read further, searching for more detail. She found scattered references throughout the winter entries, always indirect, always assumed. Stable temperatures maintained, moisture controlled, spoilage minimized. It became clear that the roof was not an accessory, but an integral component of the system. She felt a tightening in her chest as she closed the notebook. The cellar on her own farm existed, but it was exposed, its door set directly into the ground, vulnerable to wind and rapid temperature shifts. It had served in milder years, perhaps, but the notebook suggested that under sustained pressure, it would fail. Outside, the fields stood ready for harvest. The abundance of late summer still lingered, deceptive in its fullness. She understood now that abundance was not security. It was merely potential. Without the means to protect it, it would be wasted. The neighbors continued with their routines. They harvested, stored what they could, relied on freezers and deliveries that had always worked before. When she mentioned the forecasts, they shrugged. Winters were hard here, they said. They always had been. They would manage. She did not argue. Instead, she returned to the cellar. She examined it closely for the first time, running her hand along the rough wood of the door, feeling the cool air rise when she opened it. She imagined the temperature swinging wildly as storms passed overhead, imagined condensation forming, imagined rot. That night, she reread the autumn entries from the notebooks once more. This time, she noticed something she had missed before. In the margins of one page, written smaller than the rest, her grandmother had added a note. It was not dated. It did not follow the pattern of the others. It said only that the roof had been the last thing they built, and that without it, none of the rest would have mattered. The simplicity of the statement unsettled her more than any dramatic warning could have. It implied regret, or at least recognition. The roof had not been an embellishment. It had been a correction. She lay awake that night, listening to the wind move through the trees, thinking of the winter described in the notebooks and the one forecasted now. She had come here believing that observation was enough, that she could remain detached, recording what happened without being fully implicated. The notebooks denied her that comfort. They demanded participation. By morning, the decision had formed quietly, without urgency but with certainty. She would restore the cellar. She would build the roof her grandmother had insisted upon, not as an act of homage, and not as a symbolic gesture, but because the system required it. She did not know yet how she would do it, or how others would react. She only knew that the autumn was already slipping away, and that whatever was done had to be done before the ground froze. As she stepped outside, the air sharp against her face, she felt the weight of time press more closely around her. The year she had planned to observe had begun to demand choices instead. And winter, patient and indifferent, was already on its way. She began with the cellar because it was there, unavoidable, a physical fact she could no longer treat as background. The door sat at a shallow angle in the earth, its wood warped by years of exposure, its hinges stiff with rust. When she opened it in the early morning, cold air rushed upward, sharper than the surrounding autumn chill, carrying the smell of damp soil and something faintly sour. She stood at the threshold longer than necessary, measuring the space not with numbers yet, but with intuition, trying to imagine how it would behave under weeks of unbroken frost. The notebooks lay open on a crate beside her, pages weighted with a stone. Her grandmother had not drawn diagrams, but the descriptions were precise enough to form images. Depth, airflow, insulation, protection from sudden temperature swings. The roof was mentioned again and again, never elaborated upon, always assumed. A structure over the earth, creating a buffer between the cellar and the sky. The first day's work was exploratory. She cleared debris, old boards, fragments of tools left behind without ceremony. The soil around the cellar was heavier than she expected, compacted by years of rain and snow. Every movement required intention. She worked slowly, pausing often, her back aching in a way that reminded her she had chosen this, deliberately, without fully knowing the cost. By the second day, she had drawn rough plans in her notebook. They were not elegant. She had no training in construction, only descriptions and measurements gleaned from the margins of her grandmother's writing and her own careful observation. She drove into town for supplies, feeling exposed in the hardware store, aware of her unfamiliarity with materials others selected without thought. The neighbors noticed quickly. They had already accepted her presence as a temporary anomaly, a city woman playing at rural life for a season. When they saw the lumber piled near the cellar, the posts marked and measured, curiosity replaced indifference. Questions came first, casual and friendly. What was she building? Why there? When she explained, the questions gave way to smiles that lingered a little too long. A roof over a cellar, they said. An extra roof, no less. Hadn't anyone told her the ground itself was insulation enough? Winters had always been hard here. People managed. They always had. One man laughed openly, shaking his head as if at a harmless eccentricity. Another offered to lend her a generator instead, suggested modern solutions that did not involve digging and building by hand. She listened politely, thanked them, and continued. The laughter followed her back to the farm, not cruel but dismissive, the sound of people confident in assumptions they had never been forced to test. She felt the sting of it more sharply than she expected. It would have been easier if they had been openly hostile. Their certainty unsettled her because she recognized it. It was the same certainty she had once carried, that the past was inefficient, that progress rendered old methods obsolete. The work itself offered no reassurance. Mistakes were immediate and visible. A post set at the wrong angle had to be reset. Measurements that seemed correct on paper proved inadequate in practice. She lost time correcting errors she could not have anticipated. Each delay tightened the sense of urgency that had begun to press in as the nights grew colder. She worked until her hands numbed, then until they burned as sensation returned. She learned to distinguish productive pain from warning pain, to stop before exhaustion turned dangerous. In the evenings, she returned to the notebooks, cross-referencing entries, searching for details she might have missed. The writing offered no comfort. It did not praise effort. It recorded outcomes. By mid-autumn, the frame of the roof stood in place. It was rough, unadorned, built for function rather than appearance. The structure rose low and solid over the cellar, its presence altering the familiar shape of the yard. It looked excessive, even to her, a small building over another building, protection layered upon protection. She understood then why her grandmother's neighbors had laughed. The first real test came sooner than expected. A cold snap swept through the area, sudden and sharp, dropping temperatures overnight. She checked the cellar repeatedly, measuring the air, touching the walls, observing condensation where she had feared it would form. The difference was subtle, but undeniable. The temperature remained steadier than before. Moisture behaved differently, dispersing rather than collecting. She recorded everything, her notes growing more detailed, more technical. She began her first serious preservation efforts in earnest, following the notebooks with renewed respect. Vegetables were cured carefully, stored according to type and condition. Meat was prepared in quantities that felt excessive at first, then merely prudent. She found herself calculating not only her own needs, but margins, buffers, allowances for error. The neighbors noticed the preparations, too. Comments shifted tone, becoming less amused, more curious. Still, no one joined her. Modern freezers hummed in garages. Trucks made regular trips to town. There was confidence that systems would hold. Then the early storms came. Snow fell before it was expected, heavy and wet, followed by a freeze that locked it in place. Roads grew treacherous. Deliveries slowed. Power flickered and returned, then flickered again. The weather forecasts grew grim, their language stripped of speculation. She stood beneath the roof one evening, listening to the wind move over it, rather than directly against the cellar door. The structure held. The earth beneath it remained calm, insulated not only by soil, but by the deliberate space she had created above it. The laughter faded as winter advanced. It was replaced by a quieter awareness, spreading through the community, an unease that did not yet rise to panic, but no longer dismissed the warnings. She felt no satisfaction in this shift, only a deepening sense of responsibility. The notebooks had never framed survival as individual triumph. They had framed it as preparation shared, or failure multiplied. As the first real frost settled in and did not retreat, she understood that the work she had done was no longer theoretical. The roof was finished. The cellar was stocked. The system was in place. There was nothing more she could add, without time she no longer had. Standing at the edge of the yard, watching the last leaves fall, she realized that the past had not merely informed her choices, it had forced her into them. And winter, indifferent to opinion or laughter, was about to determine whether those choices would be enough. Winter did not arrive with drama. There was no single storm that announced it, no clear boundary that could be pointed to and named. Instead, the cold settled in gradually and then refused to leave. Days shortened until the light seemed reluctant to rise at all, and nights pressed against the house with a weight that felt physical. Snow fell, melted slightly, then froze again, layering the land in hard, uneven sheets that made every movement deliberate. The first prolonged power outage came in early December. It lasted only a few hours, long enough to unsettle, but not enough to alarm. People lit candles, checked generators, reassured one another that such things happened. When the power returned, life resumed its rhythm, though the hum of freezers and heaters carried a sharper note of dependence than before. The second outage lasted longer. Roads were already difficult, and trucks that normally moved through the area with reliable regularity were delayed or rerouted. Shelves in the small local store thinned quickly. Still, there was confidence. Modern systems, people said, were resilient. Repairs would come. At the farm, the winter revealed itself differently. Inside the cellar, beneath its layered protection of earth and roof, the air remained steady. She checked it daily, sometimes twice, recording temperatures, humidity, changes so slight they might have gone unnoticed by someone not looking for them. The system worked exactly as her grandmother's notebooks had described. The food held. Nothing spoiled. The balance remained intact. She felt relief, but it was not the uncomplicated relief she had expected. It carried with it a tightening sense of responsibility. The notebooks had always assumed more than one mouth to feed. She had seen that clearly now. What she had built was not meant to sustain isolation. The first knock came on a gray afternoon when the snow had been falling for nearly a week without pause. It was one of the neighboring families, standing awkwardly at the door, their faces marked by fatigue rather than desperation. They did not ask for food outright. They asked questions. How was she managing? Had she lost power? Was her cellar holding up? She answered honestly. She did not exaggerate. She did not offer help immediately. She remembered the notebooks, the careful balance between generosity and structure. When she invited them in, it was not as guests, but as participants. There was work to be done, she said. Wood to split. Snow to clear. Systems to maintain. Meals in exchange for effort. They accepted with visible relief. Not because they were hungry yet, but because the arrangement preserved something essential. They stayed for the afternoon, then returned home, promising to come back the next day. Word spread quietly, not through panic, but through observation. People noticed that her house remained warm, that smoke rose from the chimney consistently, that no one left empty-handed. By mid-December, others began to arrive, always cautiously, always with apologies they did not quite finish. She structured the days deliberately. Mornings were for essential tasks, afternoons for maintenance and preparation. Evenings brought shared meals, simple and filling, eaten without ceremony. Children began to appear, first reluctantly, then with growing ease. The farm offered not only food, but stability, something their homes could no longer guarantee as outages lengthened and supplies dwindled. The cellar became the heart of the operation. She taught those who came how it functioned, not as a curiosity, but as a responsibility. Meat was inspected and rotated. Vegetables were checked for moisture. Nothing was taken without replacement in labor or materials. The system demanded attention. It could not be left to run itself. Some resisted at first. They wanted quick solutions, shortcuts. She refused them calmly, without explanation. The notebooks had taught her that survival systems failed when convenience overruled discipline. Those who could not accept that did not stay long. Others learned quickly. They watched, asked questions, took notes of their own. One woman in particular stayed close, absorbing not only the techniques, but the logic behind them. She asked why certain temperatures mattered, why timing could not be adjusted, why the roof over the cellar mattered so much. Teaching her felt different. It felt like continuity rather than charity. As the weeks passed, the farm transformed. It was no longer hers alone. It became a place of coordination. People took shifts. Someone always tended the fire. Someone always checked the cellar. Children were kept busy with small, necessary tasks that made them feel useful rather than frightened. Education happened informally, through repetition and observation, through doing. At night, after the house quieted, she returned to her writing. Not the book she had planned to write, but the one the winter demanded. She wrote by lamplight, her breath visible in the air when the fire burned low. She wrote about the notebooks, about the system, about the way knowledge carried forward only if someone chose to receive it. The words came slowly but steadily, grounded in lived experience rather than abstraction. Outside, the winter intensified. Snowstorms piled upon one another, erasing familiar landmarks, reshaping the landscape into something severe and beautiful. Power outages became the norm rather than the exception. Some homes grew uninhabitable. People moved into the farm for longer periods, bringing what they could carry, leaving behind structures that had failed them. She felt the weight of each new arrival. There were moments of doubt, moments when she feared miscalculation, when she lay awake, listening to the wind, and wondering whether the margins her grandmother had built into the system would hold. Each morning answered that question anew. The food remained, the structure endured. By late February, the crisis had stripped away pretense. There was no longer laughter at old methods, no casual dismissal of preparation. There was only work, shared and unglamorous, and the quiet dignity of people contributing to their own survival. She realized then that the notebooks had never been about food alone. They had been about maintaining order under pressure, about preventing the collapse of social bonds when fear threatened to isolate everyone into themselves. Her grandmother had understood that hunger destroyed communities not only by emptiness, but by eroding trust. When March approached, the cold remained, but its character shifted. The light lingered longer. The snow softened at the edges. The first signs of thaw appeared, tentative and easily reversed. People began to talk not about surviving the winter, but about what came after. She listened, already thinking ahead. The notebooks did not end with survival. They moved seamlessly into preparation for the next cycle. The winter had not been an interruption. It had been part of a larger continuity. Standing one evening beneath the roof over the cellar, surrounded by people who had once laughed and now worked alongside her, she understood that the system had done what it was meant to do. It had sustained life, yes, but it had also transformed understanding. No one would leave this winter unchanged. She included herself in that truth. The year she had planned to observe had claimed her fully. And as the first tentative signs of spring approached, she knew that the most difficult choice still lay ahead. Spring arrived without certainty, testing patience one last time. The snow did not vanish in a single gesture, nor did the cold retreat decisively. Instead, the land wavered between seasons, thawing by day and freezing again at night, as if unwilling to release its hold until it was sure the trial had truly ended. The people at the farm watched these changes closely, measuring progress not in warmth, but in consistency. They had learned, through the long winter, that false hope could be as dangerous as despair. The first real sign was not visual, but auditory. One morning, amid the familiar quiet of wind and distant branches cracking under ice, there came the sound of water moving freely. Not dripping, not trapped beneath ice, but flowing. She stood at the edge of the yard and listened, recognizing the sound from memory rather than recent experience. It was the sound her grandmother had described in the notebooks as the true beginning of spring. The cellar remained cool and steady, even as the ground above it softened. When she opened the door, the air inside felt unchanged, as if winter had never reached it fully. She and those who had learned the system with her took inventory carefully, not with anxiety, but with respect. The shelves were not empty. Crates still held firm potatoes, onions hung dry and intact, preserved foods waited in orderly rows. The margins had held. There was no celebration in that moment, only a deep, collective exhale. Survival did not announce itself with triumph. It revealed itself in what remained. As the days lengthened, people began to return to their homes, one by one. Some structures required repair before they could be inhabited safely. Others had held better than expected. What mattered most was that no one returned unchanged. They carried with them not only supplies borrowed or earned, but knowledge absorbed through repetition and necessity. The farm did not empty suddenly. It thinned gradually, the way winter had retreated. Some still came daily to help dismantle temporary arrangements, to clean, to plan. Conversations shifted from immediate needs to future ones. What would be planted? What would be stored? What would be built before the next cold season returned? She listened more than she spoke. Her role had shifted again, subtly, from organizer to witness. The notebooks had taught her that leadership, like survival, was seasonal. It emerged when needed and receded when its purpose was fulfilled. One afternoon, as the ground finally softened enough to work, she walked the fields with several neighbors, discussing planting choices. The talk was different now. No one spoke of maximizing yield alone. They spoke of resilience, of crops that stored well, of diversity rather than abundance. The winter had recalibrated their understanding of success. They built before they planted. Root cellars were dug deeper than before, placed with intention rather than convenience. Roofs were constructed over them without argument. Smokehouses were planned not as novelties, but as necessities. Construction followed the same principles she had learned from the notebooks, adapted where needed, but never dismissed. She watched these changes with a quiet satisfaction she did not name. Validation had come, but it did not feel like victory. It felt like alignment. The past had not overridden the present. It had informed it. Her own writing progressed differently as well. The book she had been writing through the winter reached its natural conclusion, not with the end of crisis, but with the beginning of continuity. She wrote about the notebooks not as artifacts, but as living documents. She wrote about how knowledge survived only when it was practiced, shared, and respected without romanticism. When she typed the final sentence, she did not feel relief. She felt recognition. The book was complete because the experience it documented had reached its necessary point, not because she had exhausted the subject. The question of the farm's future returned gradually, as it had been postponed, but never erased. It arose first as a practical matter: paperwork, taxes, maintenance. Then, as an unspoken expectation. She had planned to sell. Everyone knew that. Some assumed the plan remained unchanged. She considered it seriously. She walked the property alone, retracing paths she had taken countless times over the past year. She stood beneath the roof over the cellar, now weathered slightly, its presence no longer strange, but essential. She looked at the fields not as potential profit, but as part of a system she understood. The idea of leaving felt different now. It was no longer a neutral option. It carried weight. Leaving would not be abandonment, she told herself. Someone else could come. someone else could learn. But the thought rang hollow. She realized that the year had done more than teach her survival skills. It had altered her sense of authorship. In the city, she had written from observation. Here, she had written from participation. The difference was irreversible. When she announced her decision, she did so without ceremony. There was no declaration, no gathering. She told one person, then another. The news spread quietly, met not with surprise, but with nods, as if it had been assumed all along. The farm settled into its new rhythm, one shaped by what had been learned rather than what had been inherited blindly. Children who had spent the winter there moved easily between tasks, their hands confident, their questions precise. They had seen systems work. They would not forget that. One morning, as spring finally asserted itself fully, she stood at the edge of the field, watching new shoots break through the soil. The cellar roof cast a familiar shadow nearby, no longer a point of contention, but a landmark. People moved across the land, purposeful and unhurried. She thought of her grandmother then, not as a memory, but as a presence embedded in the choices being made. The notebooks had done their work. They had bridged time, carrying forward a way of thinking that valued preparation over optimism, structure over assumption, community over isolation. The winter had tested every certainty she had brought with her to the farm. It had stripped away the belief that knowledge alone was sufficient, that intention mattered more than execution. What remained was something sturdier. As the season turned fully and the earth warmed beneath her feet, she understood that the farm was no longer an inheritance waiting to be resolved. It was a commitment she had already made, through action rather than declaration. Spring moved forward, indifferent to human conclusions. But for her, and for those who had endured the winter together, the transformation was complete and irreversible. The past had not held them back. It had shown them how to stand. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. More stories like this are already waiting for you. Watch the next video and explore others on the channel. And if this story mattered to you, share it with someone who might need to hear it.